Thank you very much for this invitation to give a talk here. I think I'm very much a mainstream economist in many ways. I'm a game theorist by training. But I think this project is really, really attractive because it provides at least someone with my background an opportunity to engage with things that are certainly considered to be outside the mainstream of many things. So without further ado, let me just very quickly get to what we are talking about here. So Austin Chamberlain in 1936 has this very interesting quotation which talks about the Chinese curse that may you live in interesting times. And what Austin Chamberlain talked about in 1936 probably applies to our current times as well, where a great deal of developments, recent developments, political and economic developments, suggest that the expectations that we might have about the future are somehow de-anchored. The conventional anchors are broken, and these expectations are de-anchored. And what we really want to understand here is that if these expectations are indeed de-anchored, then there is the possibility that multiple narratives that link the past and the present to the future may well arise. That in turn may lead to anxiety. The idea now is that because these expectations are de-anchored, then one can no longer predict what's going to happen in the future, and anxiety is very much an emotion that essentially takes into account how uncertainty about the future impacts on decisions today. Taking that narrative into account, then you are in this world where the future is uncertain. That makes people more anxious. People then behave in such a way that the future, in some sense, the uncertainty about the future is enhanced. So anxiety, in that sense, can be self-fulfilling. The idea of anxiety within economics is not new to this project. It goes back at least to the paper of Kaplan and Leahy, where they talk about how anxiety may respond more directly to possibilities than probabilities. I think the idea around anxiety can also be traced back to the work of Hirschman on the tunnel effect, because I think in part that reflects this. And as I said, the key idea of our project is to try and understand how this type of an anxiety may be self-fulfilling. To give you some sense of the kind of empirical basis for what we're talking about, you might want to look at things like the Adult Psychiatric Morbidity Survey in the UK, the latest data for which is available from 2014. And it's very clear when you read that survey that anxiety is the most commonly named psychological disorder in the UK. And from 2007 to 2014, the rise in mental health disorders for adults between the ages of 55 and 64 have been attributed in that survey to the 2008 recession. So what I'm going to do here is now I'm going to step back and let Lisa now go over a little bit more of the evidence that we have collected to back our project.
Okay, thank you. So Seant has very much focused on the theory. I'm very much the applied policy economist. Someone has always used economics for decision making, so it was very good rebuilding macro to bring us together. Just a few illustrative examples in terms of how beliefs, emotion, sentiment have gained some degree of credibility in economic decision making. So we've chosen to focus on anxiety. However, often we hear about beliefs about the economy, prevailing sentiment, optimism, pessimism. So some tools have got a degree of credibility as a tool in economic decision making. So talking about if expectations become de-anchored, then the European Central Bank will take action. On the left, on the right is a study published in the Guardian newspaper. Sorry to mention the B word so early, but economic anxiety resulting from Brexit. I'm hearing anxiety voiced in a way that I haven't since the 1990s, and the words worried, uncertain were the most repeated keywords used by respondents to describe how they felt about the future. The August edition of The Economist, Markets in the Age of Anxiety. Is this a new phenomenon, or is it very much historical? And on the left, as we're here in Scotland, is the Scottish Consumer Sentiment Index. So again, some consumer sentiment, business sentiment, has some degree in economic decision making. And as you see, with 13 quarters of positive consumer sentiment in Scotland until quarter 3 2016. And what happened in quarter 2 2016? Of course, it was the EU referendum vote, and since then Scottish consumer sentiment has been negative and plummeted in quarter 1 2019, and that was a run up to the date that we were due to leave the European Union. So then, this has led us, we talk about sentiment, we talk about expectations. Can we then actually progress this into an economic model with some degree of tractability that allows us to measure, to theoretically think about, to empirically measure, and then think about the impact on policy at a macro level? So our research questions really focus on anxiety and competing narratives. So if there's an underlying anxiety in the economy, how then do people make decisions at an individual, at a collective level, and at an aggregate level as well? Do policies have any impact, shape on competing narratives, and how can we actually measure that? Are there trade-offs between policies that aim to stabilise expectations, and also how can policy communication support these policy changes? Important distinction, so what is anxiety? We're arguing that it is distinct from uncertainty. The definition here that we've got is anxiety involves the expectation of future threat, and it's that intertemporal nature of anxiety. Your economic decisions today are very much influenced by your anxiety about the future. You may not make rational economic decisions today because anxiety levels about the future interfere with that. So the question is, can we actually build an economic model that allows us to theoretically, empirically test the effects of anxiety on the economy, and what is the role in policy of doing that? So I'll hand back to Seantan, who will talk a bit about our model.
So what I do want to emphasize is that once you begin to talk about competing narratives and so on, then you really are in a world that is quite different from the conventional macro world of rational expectations. In a rational expectations equilibrium, if there is no uncertainty about fundamentals, then essentially everybody must have a common view of the future. I mean, that's almost by definition true at a rational expectations equilibrium. Even with uncertainty about the future contingent on a particular event, it must be true that people have a common view of what's going to happen in that event. They may disagree about the probabilities of that event, but at the very least, conditional on an event, people must agree on what's going to happen. So by its very definition, rational expectations rules out the idea of a competing narrative. So what I wanted to do here is, we want to talk about, we want to first develop a solution concept for large games and markets, which moves away from rational expectations and allows for the idea of partial consensus. By partial consensus, I mean, there is some probability that most of us agree about what's going to happen about the future, but with the residual probability, we may all have different views about what may or may not happen. So the degree to which there is a consensus about the future is then the probability with which we agree on something common happening in the future. That measures in a way the degree of consensus. And partial consensus arises in a world where this probability is between 0 and 1. So probability 1 is a world in which there is complete consensus, that's your rational expectations world. Probability 0 is when you have no consensus at all. And a probability between 0 and 1 essentially says that, look, with some degree, we know a little bit about what's happening, but with the residual probability, people may have completely different expectations about the future. So that's essentially the idea of partial consensus. And what we develop is a solution concept that is consistent, that is internally consistent and coherent, and that allows us to capture this aspect of partial consensus. And essentially in this project, that's done in a separate paper where I have worked with my co-author Gabriel Desgrange on partial consensus. And then what we do is we use that solution concept in this project to see whether we can use it to understand, whether we can use it to demonstrate how lack of common knowledge about the future can act as a foundation for endogenous fluctuations. And we do this in the simplest possible setting, which is a linear dynamic model of a Keynesian beauty game. Now, what is important, I want to emphasize, is that because we want to differentiate partial consensus from other explanations of how expectations-driven fluctuations may arise, we do two things. The linearity is important because we really don't want to talk about multiple equilibria, and there's a vast literature on sunspots, of which, of course, Roger is an eminent contributor, which looks at multiple equilibria, multiple rational expectations equilibria, and so on. And then similarly, within the new Keynesian or conventional macro tradition, if there is noise about the fundamentals, if fundamentals such as preferences, technology, etc. are noisy, then essentially people may have, so that can drive fluctuations. And in more recent work by Angeletos, you may have heterogeneous beliefs about that noisy fundamentals, and in this way you can also lead to fluctuations. Except that, as is conventional in most of this new Keynesian macro literature, these expectations that drive these expectations are essentially treated like technology and preferences. So they are completely exogenous to the model itself. The model itself cannot generate these fluctuations. And in contrast to all that, we really, really want to focus on the idea that these expectations and these fluctuations arise endogenously from the workings of the model. The reason we want to do this is because I think we want to provide a rationale from a policy perspective, a rationale for so-called lighthouse policies. And the idea behind a lighthouse policy is that it's a framework or a kind of policy which provides an anchor for expectations. So if you go back to our first slide, it was all about how expectations are de-anchored, and the policy response, is to anchor these expectations on something concrete and precise. And the historical case in point is very much Roosevelt's inauguration speech, the famous one, where he talks about, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. In current times, we can talk about things like forward guidance or quantitative easing, and these are different ways in which we can interpret policies that try to anchor expectations about the future. So I was told that I should have no math on my slides, but I am by training a game theorist, so I hope you'll forgive me if I just talk you through some very basic elements of the model itself. So we can think of an infinite horizon economy. We have a continuum of okay, so
it's obvious. It's obvious.
It's obvious.
It's
Okay.
obvious. It's all fine.
Okay, it's all fine. Okay, fantastic. Well, we'll just skip that. But just to let you know that the idea behind the model is just a couple of things. One is that people have those expectations about the future. The actions they take today depend on their expected average action about the future. People may hold different beliefs, although on an average they may expect the same thing about the future. And then what we do is we construct endogenously this noisy process in a linear model, which arises only when anxiety becomes an important force. When anxiety bites. And it is precisely when anxiety bites that the conditions under which that kind of expectations-driven fluctuations arise in an endogenous way. So in this sense, anxiety can be an entirely self-fulfilling process. So I'm going to stop here and Lisa can take over and talk about all the stuff.
Thank you. So, following on from the model, as Siantan said, we're really interested in that, how that anxiety causes the expectations to fluctuate. And we argue that very much is endogenous, and linked to the point Angus made, it's social construction. So it is endogenous to the model. So from the model, what I'll try and focus on is, well, how do we operationalise this then? How can we actually empirically implement that model? How can we establish that there is a partial consensus? And in the model, the beta is actually showing the amplification or the fluctuation that anxiety impacts on expectations. So it does tie into a theoretical model, and as I said, it's very much obviously work in progress, but I'm really interested in how that anxiety destabilises the expectations, amplifies effects of future expectations, and is there any way that we can, even when there's anxiety, even when there's endogenous fluctuation, get to a point where we can have partial consensus to enable policy to be implemented and to move forward. So we follow on from other authors, such as Deaton, who looked at the sentiment, emotion of well-being, and he used survey data, Gallup survey data, to actually empirically test, changes in well-being and empirically measure over time. Ritson and Zimmerman, they looked at the concept of hope in the economy, and again used survey data on sentiment. Is hope increasing, declining, and what are the factors behind it? So following on from these methods, and obviously famously deaths of despair, Case and Deaton again, thinking about now the UK oipod epidemic, thinking about how the social health, mental health, well-being aspects actually impact directly on our economic models. So as Antantan said, if, as Kaplan and Lee say, anxiety may respond more to possibilities rather than probabilities, is there any point attempting to empirically test it? Well, we say yes, because in terms of it, as in the slide that I showed, the anxiety, there is that degree of social construction. It's not completely random, it's not radical uncertainty as well. So following on, inspiration from Professor Sheila Dow, who said expectations in our economy are socially constructed, socially communicated and believed. So if expectations are socially constructed, communicated and believed, that is the window within which economists can influence expectations. So I've developed a framework here looking at those elements of how expectations are formed, socially constructed, communicated and believed. And it's at the interface of these three elements where we establish sentiment. So socially constructed, our beliefs about the economy, how that is communicated, establishes a dominant sentiment in the economy. So are we going to be facing a recession in the next few quarters? Are we going to have another recession in the Eurozone? How does that sentiment become established? It's socially constructed, combination obviously human interaction, but obviously based on data interpretation, how it's communicated. In terms of then whether it's socially constructed and believed, that is how we establish trust in our data and our models. But it really is at the bottom, the common knowledge concept, following Schelling's concept of common knowledge as to how we tie it back to our theoretical model. So common knowledge, as Anton said, in large games and models, players in that game require a degree of common knowledge, of shared knowledge, in order to act, in order to know how others will act and how they will respond. And we argue by expectations becoming de-anchored, the economy becoming more unstable due to anxiety, it's this common knowledge that may well be breaking down. So, in terms of applying it to a lighthouse policy, again, that's our idea, our concept. How do we anchor expectations about the future again? How do we get some degree of strategic stability in our economic game? And can policy, a lighthouse policy, actually anchor expectations about the future? We have chosen the labour market. It may well be easier to apply sentiment and such beliefs, and obviously, as I said, Roger Farmer's also an expert in talking about belief in our financial markets, but we've chosen to make life a bit more difficult for ourselves and chosen the labour market for the following reasons. So following the financial crisis, you could argue the economy has very much experienced hysteresis, long-term scarring. Blanchard Krugman have said that we've lost capacity. It's a permanent loss, and the works obviously the Roger Farmers have looked at the Phillips curve, is it broken down, is it flattened, and very much the links between unemployment and inflation, and we've seen 10 years of wage stagnation. And this all links to my other work as well into productivity. So we're seeing, and if you like, an atypical recovery from the global recession. We're seeing, lots of assumptions about how the macroeconomy works changing, and many authors have, talked about secular stagnation and weakening the link between pay and productivity. We also thought for many ordinary people, and if we're talking about the policy application of macroeconomics, very much the labour market is how most people experience the economy, through their pay packet, whether they've got a job or not, whether they feel secure in their job. Okay, so we've selected the minimum wage as our lighthouse policy. And what we see in the minimum wage data, and indeed wage data in response to the financial crisis, that there is differentiated policy response to the financial crisis. So the minimum wage was very much used as a tool. Following the financial crisis, some countries cut their minimum wage, Greece and Ireland. Some countries have independent uprating mechanisms such as France, and in the UK we actually took the opposite track and increased the minimum wage substantially above average wage increases and introduced a living wage. So we see it as a differentiated policy response to the financial crisis. We're also seeing increased politicisation of the minimum wage. You could argue to influence sentiment in the economy. For example, in Hungary, the minimum wage was increased by 200% in 2 years. In the US, we've seen state-level increases, and the federal rate has not increased. As I mentioned, the UK introduced the concept of the living wage, again influencing beliefs and perceptions. And also in France, even though there's an independent uprating mechanism, the French minimum wage was increased to a higher level in response to the Gilets jaunes protests not so long ago. So it responded in an uprating higher than the automatic mechanism. So we are thinking, can policies, lighthouse policies such as the minimum wage, and the theory that we're using to aggregate that up is efficiency wage theory, and we've actually got data from the European Central Bank's Wage Dynamics Survey that actually shows that the biggest reason for employers not cutting wages during the financial crisis was morale. So across Europe, in response to the crisis, wages did not plummet. Why was that? The European Central Bank Wage Dynamics Survey said it was morale. So in terms of linking into efficiency wage theory and ideas of trust, ideas of belief about the role of wages in our economy.
If you have a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, can I finish there? Yeah, okay. I'll just finish on the anxiety, and that's great to come back in. In terms of then, how does labour market policies such as the minimum wage, how do we feed that back in then to the macroeconomic model? The anxiety transmission channels that we're most focused on, so rather than looking to the financial markets, we're going to focus on irreversible business investment and precautionary savings routes into the macroeconomic model. Irreversible business investment, in terms of anxiety in our economy, very much plays to the wait and see effect, not just business investment, delay and wait and see, and also talking again linked to productivity, trade-offs between capital versus labour decisions and costly hiring decisions as well in our economy. So it links back nicely to the minimum wage. You know, how can the minimum wage impact through these transmission channels into the macro model? Precautionary savings route again, and the theory goes that households defer consumption, increase their savings due to uncertainty. But given household debt is outstripping savings, this again endogenously amplifies the anxiety in our economy, and again may not lead to people behaving rationally as they are constrained by 10 years of wage stagnation. Interestingly linked to, again, productivity is the theory of precautionary labour supply. People may well be working longer hours due to uncertainty in the economy, and we actually see that in the UK. We've got almost 20% of people in the UK work more than 50 hours per week. So the phenomenon of overemployment, working long hours, and underemployment, and that takes us to where we want to be, the macro distributional linkages, that labour market inequality, and how that feeds into the macroeconomic model. Osher, Ilgani and Berg have a good book out looking at inequality and how that impacts on our macro models, and that is why we've chosen to really focus on the labour market. So hopefully through the kind of three components, we can get some degree of tractability as well.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to, in the last few minutes that we had, I just wanted to go back to the model and just, sorry about that, but you know, it's an old habit and you know, I can't, well, it's old habits of thinking using math, it's not difficult to get around. The one point that I wanted to make here is that the bounds, which are represented here by the letter K. So I think one of the ways in which we can think of policy here is that we can think of policy as providing the bounds within which expectations must lie. And the idea is that the narrower the bounds, then in some sense, the more anchored expectations are. And that suggests that there is a role for policy that talks about these type of bounds. I think this type of analysis as to why the role of policy and lighthouse policies may act through that particular channel, you really can't get to that by using a conventional rational expectations model, because in a conventional rational expectations model, by definition, people agree on what's going to happen in the future. So this idea that bounds are important, of course, other people and other economists have talked about the importance of these bounds and why they may matter. And, you know, I think most notably, I think the work of, other economists from so-called heterodox traditions, but actually which are very, very important ideas in economics, I think, you know, they have already pointed out the importance of that. The second thing that I want to talk about is that, you know, the model is very simple, it's linear, but essentially it can be thought of as a reduced form representation of a number of different types of economic models, which include actually the new Keynesian, because the Euler equation has this particular shape. It can be derived from an overlapping generations model with money, capital, and labor. And actually, interestingly, if you look at the old, the point that Kolesky makes in his own papers about profits depending on investment, and if investment in turn depends on expected future profits, then essentially we are back to a setting where profits today depend on expected future profits tomorrow, and that in turn would be consistent with what we do. The final point here is that the noise that we talk about is endogenous, but it is socially constructed. So there is simply no way in which that noise exists only at the level of the individual. It is entirely socially constructed, and I can go into the details of that construction if there are questions about that later on. And finally, I want to say that, you know, we can then take this very simple linear model and extend the basic linear model in such a way that essentially we get something like a conventional macro equation where, you know, some variable like AT depends on AT minus 1 plus some noise, but the noise here, that is with the slow moving trend, but the noise here is not exogenous. It is endogenously generated through these socially constructed expectations about the future. So that might, at the very end of the day, give us a kind of equation that we can take to the data and then use that to pin this noise down. But importantly, we are not talking about exogenous noise. We're talking about noise that arises endogenously from the interaction of agents. Thank you.